Caregiving isn't just a role, it's leadership. And most people are thrown into it without training, without support, and without a clue. In this episode, I talk with Jennifer O'Brien, who's been both a healthcare CEO and a caregiver to her husband, mother, and father. We get into why caregiving demands real leadership, how to stop flying solo, and what happens when you start treating this role with the respect it deserves. If you or someone you love is running point on someone's care with no pay and no support, this conversation is for you. Welcome to the Death Readiness Podcast. I'm Jill Mastriani, and this is not your dad's estate planning podcast. This is for the ones answering texts from the nursing home while heating up dinner for your kids. You're juggling meds, meltdowns, and a pile of legal what-ifs no one warned you about. If it feels like you're holding the whole family together with a binder clip and a prayer, this is for you. Sometimes the shift into caregiving isn't marked by a milestone, but by a mistake. It was the summer after my first year of law school. I had just wrapped up an internship with a federal judge. I planned to help my dad care for my mom before heading back to law school in Nashville. I understood that my mom was sick, but I didn't yet understand what that really meant. My dog, my dad's dog, my mom, and I piled into my car and headed from my parents' apartment in Manhattan to their home in the Adirondacks. We stopped at a BJ's in Utica so I could grab groceries. I left my mom in the car with the dogs and the keys so she could turn on the AC or roll down the windows. I parked in the shade. I was sure I'd thought of everything. When I came back, they were all sitting in a closed, overheated car. Windows up, no air running. I was terrified. I hadn't realized that my mom, who had always handled everything, was no longer able to do something as simple as start the car or roll down the windows. I was trying to do the right thing, and I had almost done something catastrophic. Thankfully, they were okay, but I felt like a complete failure, and I was ashamed. I'd only been a caregiver for 8 hours. I needed to get it together. That week with my mom laid the foundation for why I connected so deeply with today's conversation. My guest today is Jennifer O'Brien, author of Care Boss. Jennifer is a seasoned healthcare leader who's also been a caregiver to her husband, mother, and father. Jennifer says what so many of us need to hear. Caregiving is leadership. It's not soft. It's not side work. It's strategic, emotional, and relentless. And it deserves to be treated that way. So if you've ever felt like you're quietly running a Fortune 500 company no one sees while getting paid in guilt and exhaustion, you're not alone. You're going to get a lot out of today's episode. And if you're not a caregiver, this conversation is also for you. We are in the midst of a national caregiving crisis. If you haven't been a caregiver yet, you likely will be, or you'll know and love someone who is. This episode offers a window into their world and concrete ways you can show up for them. Spoiler alert, it's not by saying, "Let me know if you need anything." Here's my conversation with Jennifer O'Brien. Hi, Jennifer. Thanks so much for joining me today.
It is a pleasure, Jill. I'm excited about this conversation.
I am too. And I had some time to go through your new book, Care Boss. There's so much valuable information in here. And I know that you said that one of the reviews that you got was that it was jarringly practical, which I love because I think that we need to be real when we're talking about caregiving. And I liked how real you were in describing your various experiences, most recently with your husband. Because the title is Care Boss, If you could tell me why you chose that as a title and what in your background made you equate caregiving and being a boss or a CEO.
Sure, I would love to. My husband, who was a palliative care and hospice physician himself, got cancer, lived for 22 months. Neither of us have kids. And so I was the caregiver there. And then my dad, following a long illness of congestive heart failure and lung disease, broke his hip and died. I was his long distance caregiver, although able to be with him at the very end when he died. The family caregiver is a leadership position, period. It just is. And in fact, I would contend that it's the more important of the leadership positions I have held. It is more important than the CEO of a Fortune 500 company for anyone who's in it, because it's your person. You're taking care of your person, and you're entrusted with this extraordinarily important mission and vision, and this need to sort of bring everything together and communicate effectively in what is the most important thing in their life, the end of their life, and the most important thing in your life, because you will go on afterward, right? And carry with you how you handled it.
I guess also one thing I wanted to make sure that we don't pass over is the importance is quite enormous. The compensation is non-existent.
It was zero.
And so for people who are in these roles, they're doing what could be viewed as arguably the most important, most difficult job. They are receiving likely zero compensation if they're a family caregiver. They have stepped away from their career, if they have one, in order to provide these services. So that's a big deal. And I just want to acknowledge that people who are family caregivers, that happens. And it is quite a sacrifice.
It is huge. It is a huge sacrifice. Not everybody steps away from their professional job entirely.
Okay.
But often that is required. And yeah, it's a huge job, is ultimately a huge problem for our society that we kind of keep kicking that can down the road. It's a huge issue for employers. Most family caregivers do not really admit openly in the professional setting to being a family caregiver because they're afraid, they'll be passed over for promotion. People will write them off as having bigger responsibilities at home, therefore they can't do whatever. So yeah, this is a massive job, and the compensation, the monetary compensation is zero, perhaps less than zero when you think about how much it costs a household, to take care of someone. It's a very real situation. As far as the title of Care Boss, I have to credit my publisher, Wise Inc., with that. I wrote the book. I had it titled something really clever like Caregiver as CEO. And they were like, yeah, that's not the title.
Well, this is catchy. They did a great job.
Yeah, they did. They did a wonderful job.
And you go through various phases in your book, and you also have interspersed throughout letters to the person reading it. So even though it is, as someone said, jarringly practical, it does acknowledge the emotional aspect of caregiving. But I think one of the things that's so important in making the emotional part easier, not easy, but easier, is being prepared. Do you mind if we go through just a few things that you mentioned in the book are really important to have together and sort of will ease a bit of the stress in the caregiving journey?
One of the things you look at as a leader and as a caregiver is your mission or your purpose, right? The vision. We know how this ends, right? It ends usually with the person you're caring for preceding you in death. And the vision is, of course, a comfortable, dignified, peaceful death for your care recipient, and, an easier transition from caregiver to griever, and then a life beyond the death of your loved one, the life and death of your loved one for you. That's sort of the vision. That's what we're looking toward. It's hard to look toward that, but we have to. Unlike the vision of a company where we envision growing and this sort of, happy accomplishment sort of stuff, There is no joy in realizing the vision of the family caregiver because your person has died, but hopefully they are at peace.
Just to talk about the vision and the purpose and the goal. So you're saying it's really important to acknowledge what that purpose, what that goal is, even if it doesn't look happy, because that is going to guide what you're doing on a day-to-day basis.
Absolutely. And it's going to guide, if you have other family members involved or stakeholders involved, it's important to have discussed and decided that the vision is a peaceful, dignified end of life so that we can come back to that when we maybe lose our sight in the day-to-day craziness, right? That's always so helpful in leadership is to go, okay, wait a minute. What's our purpose and where are we headed? What's our purpose and where are we headed?
When you're a CEO, you're thinking about a client or maybe your shareholders, right? But you're thinking about the patient, the person you're providing care for. So when you're developing that vision and purpose, if the person you're caring for is mentally capable of having that conversation, you're saying have that conversation so that you know what that person wants. You don't need to be guessing.
100%. And there's a lot of guidance in Care Boss to facilitate those conversations. And if you are not yet caring for someone, right? You have parents that are getting older or siblings that are getting older. I say start those conversations when everyone's well. Bob and I did that. We had very clear understanding of what each other wanted and didn't want in the abstract, in end of life, such that when he got sick, then we kind of needed only to touch base. We'd already had the conversations. You used to say you didn't want this, this, and this. Do you still feel that way? Yeah, I still feel that way.
And so Bob, he was a hospice physician.
Palliative care and hospice, yes.
Okay. And we're going to talk about the difference between palliative care and hospice later. Do you think that it was easier for you and Bob to have those conversations because of what he did for a living? Or was it hard because it was you and Bob? It wasn't a patient?
I think it's always easier in the abstract before anybody gets sick, period. It's not necessarily easy when you care about somebody and you can't really imagine or nor do you want to imagine, the space between here and them dying. But I think it's intimate, right? To me, there's no greater intimacy than listening to a person when they tell you what they want and they don't want at the end of their life and committing to carrying that out regardless of what you want at the end of your life, and doing the same for each other.
Conversations like this are still hard. Expect it to be not an easy thing to do. So you kind of have to get over that hurdle to make sure that you're able to provide the best care possible. And I'm sure that you're aware of lots of situations where family members or friends, they disagree about somebody's end of life care. Well, all the more important to know concretely, what did that person want? We don't have to argue about it. We're going to ask ahead of time.
Right. And to answer your original question, which I believe was it easier for me and Bob because of his work? Perhaps. I don't know that it was easier so much as it was, it was the dinner table conversation on any given night, patients and families in the situation and their stories and where there was conflict or this and that so that, we could conclude or he could conclude, spoken or unspoken, this is what I want when my time comes. This is what I want. I will not want this, kind of thing. So it did come up more often in our setting.
And they were informed conversations.
Yes, very informed conversations. Yes, exactly.
So having had that background and knowing or at least formulating what that vision and purpose is, what should you do to be prepared? And I know we talked about and in the book is that At Peace toolkit.
The At Peace toolkit, honestly, is probably jarringly practical, and it is extremely useful at any time in your life, before someone gets sick, after they get sick, so forth. 4 steps, a couple of them are big steps, but getting stuff in order Everything from having your medical ID on your cell phone to putting all of your financial information and access to deeds to all the property, et cetera, getting that all in one place. Whether you want a will or a trust, all that sort of stuff. There's sort of a long checklist of items to think about. Do you have cryptocurrency, right?
Right.
And maybe you don't, so it's a non-issue, but maybe you do. That's what the At Peace Toolkit is. The At Peace Toolkit is in the book, and it's also available on my website as a free download. If you're not in the throes of caregiving and you don't really want to buy the book yet, then please download the At Peace Toolkit. I recently received feedback from a group of 15 women who are good friends, and they had decided that the 15 of them were going to meet every Monday night for 10 weeks using the At Peace Toolkit. And at the end of the 10 weeks, all 15 of them felt like they had certainly a much more comprehensive end-of-life plan and preparedness for themselves and their spouses. Several of them had set up, for those who had children 18 and older, had set up advanced directives for them and had started on this similar work on behalf of their parents.
And for advanced directives, and I'm going to include a link in the show notes to your At Peace Toolkit. For the advanced directives, and you say this in your book, but there are websites where you can go to find your state's form of healthcare advanced directive. And also, I'll include those links in the show notes for anyone who wants to do that.
Great.
But for this group, you said it was 15 women, right? Of any of those women, did they have difficulties with their spouses, for those who were married, their spouses providing information or participating? Any pushback that they shared?
Yes, they did. They're all in heterosexual traditional marriages.
Okay.
And yes, there was more than one husband who at the beginning of the process was sort of like, well, why are you doing this? This is not entirely supportive. But by the end, all the couples gathered.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
that is
yeah.
fantastic.
And it gets even better. They played, there's a game. It doesn't have to be a game. It can be just a tool called the Death Deck.
I've heard of this, and I will link to that in the show notes as well for anyone who's interested.
The Death Deck is an amazing tool just to start the conversations.
And do you pull cards and it asks questions?
Yeah. So on the 11th Monday night, all the couples got together and they played the Death Deck together. And by then, all the husbands were totally on board, realized how important what their wives had done really was in their lives. And the nice thing about the Death Deck is it really helps you. It's got some humor in it. Most of the cards have multiple choice questions. So there'll be kind of a couple of serious answers and then a funny kind of extreme answer, and it's mainly to stimulate conversation. So yeah, they all came on board by the end of it.
That's excellent, because I worry that some people who might have resistance from a spouse in doing this, especially if they're doing it on their own and not with a group, they might think, okay, maybe this is stupid. Maybe I shouldn't be doing it.
I think you're absolutely right in thinking that. There are a couple of things I want to be sure and say about this particular story of these 15 women. One is the accountability factor. So it's just like working out, right?
Right.
When you tell your friend, we're going to meet at the gym and we're going to do our workout, you're that much likelier to show up and actually do the workout, right? So that really helps, I think. Doesn't have to be 15, 14 of your besties. It can be 2 or 1. You work out with a personal trainer sometimes, so why not just have it be one person if you commit? I do think the 10 weeks was a realistic and ambitious time frame, both. And it doesn't have to be every week, certainly, but the accountability to the other, it's not just accountability, then it's also support. So that if you aren't getting the support at home, in your circle, in your family unit, then you get it somewhere else, right? From your partner.
Right. And I have a friend who is married, works full time, has 3 kids, all minors. And her husband also works full time. And she was trying to put this together and she kept feeling like it's too much. I've got too much going on. And I said, how about we meet Saturday morning before your kids get up? We're just going to meet for 15, 20 minutes. And we've been doing that. I mean, she's got her coffee. She's barely awake. But what's fun about it, too, is her husband's awake and he's like checking in with her before. Do you need any information from me before you get started? So they're forced kind of to check in and they've got this deadline. And you can get a lot done in 15, 20 minutes.
The other thing that I think is super important in this, and I had told one woman who had kind of organized this, these women are all in their mid-50s. I'm about to turn 60, and I recently redid my end of life documents. I recommend you redo them or you look at them. You don't have to redo them if there's nothing to change, but every leap year, every 4 years, unless there's a major, get divorced, and obviously you want to take care of things right away, because that is rough when you get divorced and then you don't change your end of life documents and your spouse ends up.
And nobody wants that. Your ex-spouse doesn't want that either.
So minus a major life change, I recommend every 4 years. Now, this is important because when you feel relatively young and healthy, I think, there's a good likelihood I will live for another 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
Really hard to imagine, who's going to be alive to be my executor in 20 years. You're not deciding it for 20 years. You're deciding it for the next 4 years. What is going to work tomorrow and for the next 4 years? And when I redo, for example, next time I have plans of changing my executor is my best friend and she's my age. 4 years from now, I have every intention. I am grooming a young couple to be my executors because I don't want somebody my age or older, because there's a really good chance they won't be in great shape to do it or they will be dead already, so I want to transition that. She gave me the feedback that they came back to that several times, that they found themselves getting tripped up on how old are my kids going to be, thinking, well, they're young adults now, but you don't think that far ahead, just for the next 4 years. Is this going to work for the next 4 years? Yes.
The other aspects that go with that, and honestly, when I wanted to ask you about the medical records and the documentation file, which I think goes hand in hand with the go bag in terms of being a caregiver. But I actually was thinking when I was reading about the go bag that maybe I should have one too, because you have emergencies, as just regular people, even if you're not in a caregiving situation. Could you explain the importance of the go bag? And I liked the example in the book that you gave of, a caregiver living so far from the hospital.
Yeah.
But also just having all that medical information very accessible.
Right. Sadly, as much automation as we have in this world today, we have different medical record systems with different hospital and doctors' offices and so forth. So the best thing a family caregiver can do is keep, in my mind, sadly, paper is more effective, although I do think there are some apps that have come a long way for scanning and having it all, like my chart, having it all on your device. But paper is effective, especially if you're traveling or whatever, and you're just not sure where you might end up in an emergent situation. So the caregiver keeps the medical records, the current medication list and doses, keeps that together, adds the new stuff to it as it happens, and brings it with them to even regular visits. When someone gets really sick, with some frequency, that a regular visit to the doctor or the oncologist turns into a hospital admission, right? We didn't realize we have, shortness of breath or all these things that happen. My father, I know, coded once in an outpatient visit and had to be admitted. And then the go bag, in my dad's case, like I said, his office visits frequently turned into hospital admissions. And the guy that was his present caregiver, wouldn't bring the basics with them to the doctor's office visit. Like, honestly, sometimes his reading glasses, his teeth, his power cord for his phone, these things that are important to have if you're going to be away from home in a hospital setting for a night or two. or more.
And at least for something like his teeth, you can't just go pick those up at the drugstore.
Right. You can't get a second one. Right. Yes. A second set. I mean, you could, but it would be a lot of effort. Yeah. So just recognizing that there is a go bag. I mean, you have a go bag in pregnancy, right? At a certain point that's ready
Right.
to go for the hospital stay. So it's a similar thing like that. And obviously there's not an extra set of teeth, but you make it a point of throwing that in the go bag when it's time to go to a doctor's visit. And certainly when you have to go to the ER or whatever you might have to do. But the medical records and the go bag. And I've gotten feedback from one reader of Care Boss who's caring for her mother, had to transfer her mother from one nursing facility to another, an inpatient hospice setting. And because of Care Boss, she had made a very detailed list of her mother's medications and dosages and was able to catch that they were missing 2 medications when she made the transfer. So it's important. You're the advocate. You're the one who knows best. I think a lot of healthcare professionals don't realize how the family caregiver is an extender of the healthcare system, is an extender of the physician or the nurse. Yeah.
Right. And I do actually have a resource, a caregiver information sheet that I'm going to link to in the show notes if anyone just wants to look at it. I know that my daughter and I will be with my dad at his house this summer. He lives on a beautiful lake. And I gave him a file that had all of our medical information with our health insurance cards. And I said, if there's ever an accident or anything happens, or if you have my daughter and something, I want you to have this. You know, you don't want people guessing at that point. So I think it is helpful for everyone to have that information together. The other thing that I think is so important in a caregiving relationship, and I think a lot of people, especially on the outside, don't quite know how to approach and ask for help. And you might, as the caregiver, get a lot of, let me know if there's anything I could do. I'd love to help. Let me know. Unfortunately, I think what that does unwittingly is put yet another responsibility on the caregiver to figure out what that person can do to be helpful. Can you let me know how you would suggest approaching that as a caregiver? How might you respond to that? And that as someone who's on the outside, what are more helpful things that you can offer?
Sure. First of all, leadership and caregiving are 2 of the loneliest jobs on earth, I think. It feels very, very lonely. You feel alone. You are not entirely alone, right? You can identify, if nothing else, professional caregivers that are in the scene, right? That are there. And if you work at it, you can identify people who actually have done some helping, and then people who, could help. And then there's those offers that you just described. Let me know if there's anything I can do to help. That is a common thing that folks say. They do it because it makes them feel better. They think, I said, if she needs anything, just let me know. And I would say, as the recipient of that, some of those people are just doing exactly what I just described. All they're doing is making themselves feel better, and they probably won't help you, or you don't want their help. I've certainly been in that situation before. But you also know that there are people who mean it. Sometimes it's surprising who offers, and you realize they've been through this. And those are the ones you don't have to have the answer on the spot. Hey, yeah, there's this you could do for me. But in the book, it talks about ways of identifying tasks that can be delegated and ways of identifying who the best types of individuals are to take on those tasks.
So what would be an example of a person who might fit with a particular task?
So let's say your person's birthday is coming up. You know it should be marked, right? Whether they know it's their birthday or not. You know it needs to be marked. You know you'll feel better if it's marked in some way. But, with everything you're doing, the last thing you have time to do is to notify a handful of people so that they can send cards or show up, get a cake, whatever it is. So that's something you could delegate. And that talks about the types of sort of motivators, types of people. And one of the types is the person who's social, who's is always saying, let's have a potluck, or let's go do this, or this thing is happening down at the river. Let's take a picnic. That's the person I would call up and say, mom's birthday is coming up in 2 weeks. We need to keep it simple, but I know you're the person to get a cake and notify these folks, or, give them some parameters to go with, and then hand that off and allow that to happen without you having to do every last detail of that, so that you can focus on things like the go bag or the at peace toolkit or some of the other more pressing things that happen throughout the day.
Or if somebody, I think maybe a neighbor says, I'm going to the grocery store. Is there anything I can get you? Is it helpful to keep just a list on hand of things that you generally need and then say, here's a list. Could you get all this stuff or whatever you can?
Yes, that's actually tapping into, if you want to be a more effective support and friend to your caregiver friend, instead of saying, let me know if there's anything I can do, what I do is I text in the morning and say, at around 1, I am headed to the grocery. Give me a list of what you need and I can leave it on your doorstep. And so that's notifying, that's giving them the times. I'm not in the grocery saying, hey, I'm here. What do you need? So that they have to answer right away. Giving them a few hours to pull that together. It's also letting them know, I am not expecting a visit with you out of this, right? I am going to leave this on your doorstep and I'm going to head out. This is not going to cost you time and effort. This is something I can actually do for you. So when you find yourself thinking you'll say, let me know what I can do to help, instead say, I'll check in periodically. No need to respond, but I welcome the responses too.
I think that's a really good point. I think people can get easily offended if there is not a response. But I think that's a situation where you need to think of it from the caregiver's perspective. There's simply too much going on, and you're there as the outsider to offer support, not to become another task on the to-do list.
Right. In my first book, which was my art journal that I kept while Bob was dying, there's a journal entry that says, our best friends in this are the ones who check in frequently, usually by text, with no expectation of a response. And I cannot tell you, as both a caregiver and a griever, how much that means when someone just texts thinking of you and they do not expect me to respond. Today I would respond because I'm not caregiving or, in the throes of acute grief. But I mean, that is just so, because you feel forgotten. Occasionally someone would check in with Bob, right? He had cancer. He was dying. They were like probably thinking to themselves, I better check in with Bob, before he dies. And I haven't checked in with him. But almost nobody thinks, I better check in with Jen because she's taking care of Bob, right? So the caregiver feels, in my opinion, perhaps even a little more isolated than the care recipient.
Okay.
And maybe that's just that's the only perspective I've had in all of these situations. Maybe I'll feel differently if I get sick, but.
Well, I think the takeaway is check in with your people who are going through a crisis. Don't expect a response.
Don't expect a response. Right.
Whether it's the caregiver or the person being cared for, I think both people need that check-in without an obligation.
And I often tell people when they get diagnosed, maybe not that instant, but, a few days or weeks later, I'll say, I'm going to text you periodically. Please don't feel like you have to respond. I just want you to know I'm thinking about you, just to kind of establish that I don't expect anything in return.
And then if somebody does something for you that's helpful, I liked that section in your book where you talked about positive feedback, because it really did seem to be a really valuable thing for the person who comes and helps out, and might keep that person coming back to help if they know that their help is valued.
Absolutely. Pinpointed positive feedback is the most powerful tool in a leader's toolbox, without a doubt. What I mean by pinpointed is something specific.
So, what would be the help that was provided and then the positive feedback you could give?
The example I provide in the book is that someone, let's say a sister or a, cousin or whatever, comes and stays with the care recipient while you go to your own doctor's appointment or whatever it is. And we write a follow-up note that says, thank you. And you must have had some really good time with mom because she was particularly content and alert when I got home. And thanks for emptying the dishwasher and straightening up. It really gave me some time to work on the medication list or whatever other task. I'm being very specific about not just thanks, good job, but there were some very specific positive outcomes from this based on your specific behaviors. And here's what they were and are. I think that does a couple of things. If you're in a position to share, let's say it's a family, let's say you have multiple siblings and there's kind of a mixture of participation and help, right? Something like that, you could send to your 3 siblings and say, Susie, and be specific with Susie about these wonderful things that she did and the positive outcomes as a result. And everyone can read that, right? You cannot share openly feedback for improvement. That's not okay in any setting. That's private. But pinpointed positive feedback. Now, Susie is learning what she did that was so effective. And so are the other 2 siblings who are reading that email or text or group text or whatever it is. And they're going, okay, next time I do it, I'm going to look around for some tasks I can help out with, kind of thing, so that they understand that's performance, right? That's
right. That's a good segue into the family meetings. When I was reading the book, I thought, this is a great way to keep people informed in an organized way. And I think people might think it is too formal, but you can't have all of these side conversations. People feel left out. They don't get all the information. This is a really efficient and I think compassionate way to keep everybody on the same page.
Right. I mean, it goes back to the CEO paradigm, right? You have board meetings and you have team meetings and you communicate in real time, give and take in those situations. Why wouldn't you do that when the mission and vision of caring for your person and seeing them through, is so huge and so potentially life-changing for everyone, right? Why wouldn't you employ the same tools and practices that you do when you're running a business? So that's kind of where that comes from. And, it's not necessary to follow Robert's Rule of Order, but it's not a birthday party, right? It's not, oh, let's just catch up on how everybody is. It's a meeting. We can start with some chit chat, but we need to get into the agenda. And I do recommend an agenda. Sometimes, certainly in the business setting, I use the components of the business, in this case, the sections of the book, as my basis for an agenda. It may be that we have nothing to talk about on team and resources today, but that's something that stays in the standing agenda, just as a format.
What would be each of those components? Do you recall them off the top of your head?
Sure. The sections of the book that I would include as part of the agenda are 1, strategy and planning, 2, team and resources, 3, data and analysis. The 4th is facility and environmental services and supplies. And the last one is self-management. That may or may not need to be in the agenda. I happen to think it does because if you're the primary caregiver, you need to be letting folks know what you need or what's going better for you, that kind of thing, as the full-time primary caregiver.
And what if one of your siblings in the meeting says, well, I know it's really important for mom that she doesn't go into a facility. Can you promise that she won't go into a facility?
No, I can't. I can't make that promise. I recommend that you do not make promises like that to your person, to the care recipient, or to anyone else, that is simply not a promise that you can for sure deliver on. Any promise, anything that involves the word always or never, I will be with you when you die. No, 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 no. Do not make that promise, because you might not be, for all kinds of reasons, including lots of people like to die alone. When you're in the hospice situation, it's recommended, especially when everyone's around, that periodically, if the person is actively dying, that periodically everybody leaves the room, because lots of people prefer to let go when no one is there. And so that would just be silly to make a promise like that. And you could tell yourself, well, my mom has dementia, so she's not going to remember that I promised her I wouldn't put her in a nursing home. But the truth is, you'll remember, right?
Exactly.
This is not just about the care recipient. This is about you and how you'll go on with how you handled yourself and the situation long after your person dies. So if you've made a promise and then you have to live with the fact that you didn't uphold the promise, and that can make a very tough grief situation complex. And trying to prevent that, we're trying to get ourselves to pure grief from love, grief from love and loss, not grief from remorse and regret. That's the objective.
And you mentioned earlier in the conversation that your husband, Bob, was a palliative care and hospice doctor. Can you explain what the difference is between palliative care and hospice? Because I think those are two terms that we hear together a lot and maybe think that they're the same thing, but they're not, are they?
No, they are not. They are absolutely not synonymous. To palliate means to comfort or to ease suffering. So palliation or palliative care is included in hospice, right? That's what hospice is all about. There's a prognosis of 6 months or less to live, and we are keeping that person comfortable. We are palliating that person through this remainder of their life. However, palliative care as a subspecialty does not mean there's only 6 months to go or less. Palliative care is when the person is living fully, right? Palliative care can include treatments, life-extending treatments, curative treatments, but they're still getting this extra help that palliates any extra pain, any suffering, psychosocial issues that come with an illness, sometimes familial caregiver issues that come with a major illness. My best example of this is that Bob, my late husband, had a patient, and she was in bad shape. He was really worried about her. She'd been a palliative care patient for a long time. She was a kidney transplant patient and needed palliative care on and off throughout her life. And her second kidney was coming to the end of its run, and she was very, very sick. And she got her third kidney, and he visited her on her third post-op day, which was also his last day working before he had to quit because of his own illness. So she and I have connected since his death. She adored him. We talk about him fondly, but she is very much alive and he's not. So
how long ago did Bob die?
Bob died 8 years ago.
And so she was receiving palliative care 8 years ago.
8 years ago. She doesn't, to my knowledge, receive it now. She's very healthy. But yeah, it was very helpful to her to have palliative care during her illness. And she's made a full recovery.
Okay.
Just so we're clear, you are absolutely right. Lots of people think the word hospice and the term palliative care are synonymous, including physicians and nurses. And lots of people throughout healthcare think those two terms mean the same thing. So if you are in a situation where you think you will benefit from the extra help that is palliative care, and we're pretty sure your person's nowhere near dying, may in fact make a full recovery, and you say to a physician, I would like a palliative care consult, and that physician or nurse says, it's too soon for that, or no, we're not there yet, that is indication to you that the person you're talking to does not understand the difference between the two.
What would you recommend doing in that situation?
Yeah, I would recommend insisting. Thanks. I don't think we're near end of life either, but I know that palliative care can help during life extending treatment and curative treatment as well. It's just an extra layer of help. And I would like to consult with them. That's all. I would just push a little harder.
And it's helpful for you to say, I don't think we're near end of life either, if that is in fact the case, sort of helping that person understand that palliative care is not just for end of life care and
Right.
that you would like to proceed with a consultation.
Right.
And sometimes it's easier for a caregiver to do that pushing back than for the care recipient themselves sometimes.
Often, yes, I think so for sure. But yeah, palliative care and hospice, both relatively new specialties, palliative care especially, and still not well understood within medicine. And the culture of medicine, is the fight, right? Fight
Right.
cancer. And the truth is that's not the way life works, right? Life, it's an arc, and at the end of the arc comes death. And lots of professionals don't like to address that, but we would just all be so much better off if the professionals and the non-professionals would see that.
So, in your book, I read something that made me realize I don't understand certain aspects of hospice. You said that Bob did not want to die at home, but at one point he was not ill enough to be admitted to inpatient hospice. So, is there a difference between qualifying for home hospice and inpatient hospice?
Yes, absolutely. So, first of all, hospice is not a place so much as a status, right? That status is that the person is not receiving life extending or curative treatments and has a life expectancy of 6 months or less.
The 6 months or less, who is making that determination?
Typically a physician. Important to know that, though, because depending on what the primary diagnosis is for your care recipient, there's just so much in our culture that doesn't address death and doesn't address how far out someone thinks we are from death, like a physician. So it's important to understand that distinction too, and to kind of be looking out for that.
If you as a caregiver think that your care recipient is near end of life, how do you advocate or even ask for the evaluation to determine whether home hospice is available or appropriate?
I think you talk to the primary physician, the oncologist, or the neurologist, or whoever it is.
It's someone on the care team that you're reaching out to.
Yeah, you typically, now I think it's never too early to start researching the hospices in your community because they are quite different. The basic premise of hospice is the same. Services are inclusive, equipment is inclusive, but the culture of the hospice is different. Profit or not for profit, different markets have different certification needs. So, like, I live in Arkansas. We have a certificate of need situation. Nobody can just hang out a shingle and call themselves a hospice. The state has to say, yes, there is need for a hospice in this community and give you permission to create a hospice. Whereas California, Nevada, Arizona, these are all states that have zero certificate of need when it comes to hospice. So every Tom, Dick, and Harry is out there hanging a shingle and calling themselves a hospice, whether or not they are fully capable of delivering hospice services. Some of them are outright fraudulent. So to me, again, if we're talking about this incredibly important vision of a peaceful, dignified death for your loved one, a smooth transition from caregiver to griever, and a full life for the caregiver that's gone on after the loved one has died, this is a big, important mission. Why would you save the research about what organization is going to help you with that mission till the last minute? Why would you just turn to the doctor or the hospital and say, okay, well, which hospice do I go to? No. You have the ability to start that research, start thinking about maybe it's a religious affiliation. Maybe you want a Catholic hospice, maybe you want a Jewish hospice. These are all important factors or might be important factors in, selecting a hospice for this very important part of the vision.
If the physician on the care team determines that hospice is appropriate, then someone such as a family caregiver would then go out and determine which hospice organization is the one that they want to work with.
So you have that option. Lots of times, depending on the specialty, right? Like oncology and neurology with ALS, the stuff where we know hospice is coming at some point in this trajectory. Physicians have hospices that they prefer and will recommend, hey, give you the card or give you the name of a particular hospice. And that is certainly an option, but it is not an obligation. If you've already taken a look at, there's this hospice in town, I really like them, I want my person to go there, or my person said they want to. Bob knew exactly which hospice I would be calling, right? And told me so. He didn't have to tell me. I knew which one he felt strongly about. Or in the case of a hospital stay, right, where it's very clear that the person has made the decision to go home to comfort care and hospice care, or they may not be able to leave the hospital. In the case of my dad, he refused the hip surgery. He knew he was dying, and we put him on hospice status in the hospital room where he was. Of course, I knew he wasn't going to live long afterward, but he could not ambulate because he couldn't do anything out of the bed because of his neck of femur fracture. Same with my mother. She couldn't get out of bed. And so both of them ended up in an inpatient hospice setting.
How do the qualifications for inpatient hospice differ from home hospice?
Yeah, so I am probably not the best person to ask there has mobility issues and whether or not the person can be taken care of in the home.
But Bob knew. He knew kind of where he was on the spectrum. Is it correct that inpatient is a more, severe situation?
Yes, more severe and more expensive. And that's part of the reason that you can't just choose to be inpatient. I want to go on hospice. I want to be in a facility where someone will take care of me, where my loved ones don't have to take care of me 24/7. You can do that, but Medicare and third-party insurance payers are not going to pay for that, right? You're going to pay to be in that facility unless the hospice physician determines that you cannot be cared for in the home setting. You have to be in a facility. And then there's some hoops they have to jump through with the payer to get there. And that's more and more strict because of the added expense.
And why, if you don't mind me asking, you don't have to answer certainly, did Bob want to be in a facility or inpatient hospice?
Yeah, Bob did not want to die at home. He was very clear about that. By the time Bob died, he had worked in a hospital for 50 years. He started as an orderly, what was then called an orderly, at age 18.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And he knew from that job on that he wanted nothing more than to take care of patients. And he had spent most of his holidays in a hospital because he didn't have kids. And both when he was a surgeon, because he was a surgeon before he was a palliative care and hospice physician, and as a palliative care and hospice physician, most of his partners had families and kids, and they wanted to be home for the holidays. And so he would take more holiday call than lots of his partners because of this. So he spent lots of holidays in the hospital. He was very at home in a hospital setting. And so I think that's part of it, why he didn't want to die at home.
All right. So I wanted to shift a little bit to the more emotional side of caregiving because I know we talked about a lot of practical things, but it is emotional. You're going through a lot. The care recipient is going through a lot. I liked one particular section when you were talking about how you had to take over the medication management for Bob. And this was a pivotal moment really in his transition because he was a physician and he could no longer do that. And that was a very emotional change for you. How did you get yourself to the point where you could take on that task?
It was very emotional. Bob, identified as a physician, and even through 99% of his illness, he was very proprietary about the medications. Medications are a big deal, as an aside, right? There are many medications, certainly in hospice, but also in palliative care, that have a street value of 5 times that of cocaine. When you think about some of the opioids and so forth. And diversion is a very real issue when you're talking about these kinds of medications being in the home. So not that Bob thought I was going to divert any medication, but it was in his blood at this point to be very meticulous. He risked losing his license for a long time if medications that he prescribed got diverted. So it was second nature to him to be very meticulous about the medications. He was the doctor, and I'm not going to question him when he's already got so much going on in his life and he's losing agency because of his illness. So, fine with me. I don't need to pay attention to that stuff if he's paying attention to that stuff. And then there came a day, when he was admitted to hospice status, that it was just very clear that he was not able to do that anymore. And it was heartbreaking for me. After the intake visit with the nurse, he was tired and he went back to the bedroom and fell asleep. And I just sobbed, with this we had this container where all the medications were kept. And I just looked at them and cried about my husband dying, cried about, oh my gosh, now I have to do this kind of thing, and got it out of my system. And then realized, wait a minute, I can do this, right? I can look up every single one of these medications, what they're for, plot it out. I'm a smart person. This is not. And I was able to, sort of get the heart stuff out of the way, the emotional stuff, and the head stuff kicked in, and it was objective. This is not, the fact that Zofran is for nausea is not open to debate. It's a fact.
It's data.
There's great comfort in that when you are dealing in a very emotional, otherwise very emotional situation, is to, wait a minute, I can look at this as data. I can plot out the schedule. Also, time, incredibly objective, not subjective in any way, no matter how we look at it. So yeah, that really helped me. That's one of the reasons there's an entire section of the book called Data and Analysis, because there are some things that you can look at objectively. And I find that very comforting. I find an outlet where, no, we're looking at data, we're looking at facts, is just so much better. It's a relief, if you will, from all the emotional stuff.
Another part of the book where you share your emotions is in these letters to the reader. In one of these letters, Bob was at the end of his life, and you talk about him being in the shower. And I think you don't even know how he quite got himself into the shower, but you had a lot of difficulty getting him out. And you talk about how you're in the shower fully clothed and you're swearing under your breath. And I thought, I can relate to that, because you almost think that you're supposed to be saintly and perfect if you are a caregiver, but yet you are in the shower fully clothed and you are swearing because, that's just what's coming out of you. And I think that was just really helpful to see the human element of what you're doing, so that the caregivers who are reading this aren't so hard on themselves when they find themselves doing things that maybe in a perfect world, they'd handle it differently.
Right. That I can once again thank my publisher, Wise Inc., for, because, the book was mostly practical how-to sort of stuff. And they said, this is good, but it's not great because you're not sharing any of your personal experience and stories. And that's where the idea to write, it's formatted like an email, Dear Caregiver. And at the beginning of every single section and at the very end, I write to the reader, to the caregiver reader, about a very personal or several personal experiences. And they typically relate to what's coming in the section. That shower incident, which was very hard to write and is even harder to read, comes at the beginning of the section that is about facility supplies and what we call in healthcare environmental services, which is housekeeping, for lack of a better synonym, because in healthcare and leadership, those play a huge role. The facility is, right, a huge part of this ability to deliver top-notch care. If the power goes out in my practice, I got to get everybody out of the building, right? I can't use the elevators. There's just, facility is perhaps a more important component of the leadership in a healthcare situation than lots of other business situations. And I wanted people to understand that as a family caregiver, your home or your care recipient's home or nursing, wherever they're residing, wherever you're taking care of them, is the facility. And it has a super important role.
And the problem from that shower situation, well, you and Bob had done so much to prepare for your survivorship and for his death. And one of those things that you did was you moved into a condo because that was going to be better for your survivorship. Unfortunately, in that condo, you said the floor in the bathroom was so slippery, you don't know how anyone ever decided to put that type of flooring in.
Yeah.
And there was a bit of a lip in the shower, which you described as Mount Everest in terms of trying to get Bob out.
Not exaggerating. This was a curb of 6 inches by 6 inches by 6 inches. That is a very large shower curb. I have redone that bathroom now. And I can tell you that in lots of residential settings, especially out in communities like Scottsdale, Arizona, where there's a lot of elderly folks, they're making flat curbless showers for that reason, that you have a sick enough person, one step, a sunken living room, that's Mount Everest. I mean, it is hard to navigate even one step over a curb that size or one step, down or up. So yeah, I couldn't get him out.
Well, you did get him out.
I did get him out. Yes, I got him out. I got him out safely by the grace of God, basically. And the other thing is, just an aside, if you are an interior designer and you are putting marble on the floor of a bathroom, you deserve to have your license revoked. I mean, it just that is not good in any way. Put it in the foyer. Do not put marble on a bathroom floor.
Another thing that's helpful and that I've been reading a lot about is people designing their homes for accessibility. I was actually walking the dogs, talking to my husband about this the other night as we saw new builds going up in the neighborhood. And I said, there's no reason why, if you're building something from scratch, you can't make it accessible because, we're all getting older, but why should we not have a home if we have the option of it being accommodating to someone who is in a wheelchair or who otherwise is, not able to move as easily? Those are definitely things I think we should all be thinking about if we are remodeling or if we're constructing a new home.
Absolutely. No, I couldn't agree more. When I redid the bathroom, unfortunately, I was not able, because of the building I live in, to put an entirely curbless shower in, but the curb is much, much smaller. I went ahead and put grab bars. I mean, I'm turning 60. It's not like I'm going to get more agile, right? I'm going to get less. And I don't want to redo a bathroom again in 5 years, right?
Right.
I want this to be, this is it, right? Hopefully this is the last bathroom remodel of my life. So yeah, I did it not just for today, but for the future.
If someone is hearing about these different experiences that caregivers might have and might think, okay, well, how is the caregiver taking care of themselves? And one thing that you talk about in the book is you don't want to have any self-care shaming, such as, Jennifer, why don't you go get a pedicure? You really need to take care of yourself. How does that feel as a caregiver when somebody's telling you to do that sort of thing?
Well, you can conclude pretty quickly that they've never been in your situation if that's the remedy that they're offering. The book has an entire section on self-management, as I mentioned earlier. I make a distinction between what I call self-management and self-care. Self-care is a buzzword at this point. It equates with a pedicure
Yes.
and piece of chocolate cake or whatever, self-care,
Anything at the spa, a massage.
hashtag self-care, chocolate chip cookie, hashtag self-care, kind of stuff. And I'm not saying that a caregiver does not need some chocolate chip cookies on occasion, but that's not it. Self-management is much larger than that, especially in a large job like caregiving. And I find it just disheartening when people sort of say, this is my favorite. When I say favorite, I mean that entirely sarcastically. They sort of have this, wrinkle brow and finger wagging tone to their voice and say, well, if you don't take care of yourself, you won't be able to take care of him. It's like, no kidding, right? Like, we know that. Caregivers know that. We don't need you to tell us that, especially the doctors and nurses who are some of the first to say that phrase. We know that. That doesn't help. That's contraindicated, right? That is not helping this situation at all. So yeah, self-care. Some days when you're in the throes of family caregiving, the most self-care you can achieve is 4 consecutive deep breaths. And that's it. That's all you get, because the job calls for a pretty intense presence, a lot, not much sleep, that sort of thing. So self-care and self-management are, yes, super important, but my recommendation to friends that are trying to help caregiver friends is, facilitate something. When you're out running those errands and you run by the coffee shop with their favorite drink, get them one, leave it on the front porch or the, doorstep, and text and say, there's a surprise for you on your front porch. And, do it, create that little bit of self-care.
The other thing to note is the coffee's left on the front porch. That person dropping off the coffee is not requiring anything from the caregiver.
Exactly.
It is simply a full gift, and also perhaps offering, depending on the situation, to sit with the care recipient while the caregiver walks for a half hour outside. Little things that don't cost anything but a bit of time, but could really change at least the mental perspective of the caregiver.
Absolutely. It's one of the reasons I do think that self-management needs to be part of the agenda for the family meeting, right? Because why not? If we've got some siblings that live close by, I could sure use 30 to 60 minutes for a walk every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. So let's build that in. You get some quality time with mom, and I get to go on a walk and be by myself, or go sit in a park and cry, or whatever it is I need to do to manage my own well-being.
I want to talk about what you refer to as precious time. And I don't know if I said that correctly. I know the accent goes on the word precious, but I've heard you say it before. And so if you could say it for us the way you say it and why you say it that way, which is the way Bob said it. Am I right?
Yes, exactly. So it's precious time. The emphasis is meant to be on the first word, precious. I guess I put more emphasis on the first syllable, but whatever. I do what I do to remember it. And this was the term that Bob used to tell patients and their families that death was nearing. He would say, you're into precious time. And precious time is when you focus on what you have to say, the I love yous and the I forgive yous and the thank yous and the goodbyes. And you maybe don't say what you would later regret saying. You don't get a second shot at precious time. And people totally understood. His patients and their families knew exactly what he meant when he used the term precious time. They knew he meant you're dying. And this is important because much of healthcare doesn't deal with death. Even in hospice, they don't use the word death very often. They'll talk about transitioning. They sometimes talk about last breath, things like that, but it's hard to, as a professional, as a person, it's hard to say death and dying to someone whose loved one is dying. It's a hard term to deliver. And so by calling it precious time, he let them know your person's dying, you're dying, but he also shifted the focus. So the average duration of family caregiving is 4.5 years. That's the average. This is a long time that you have been focusing on things like, did he get a good night's sleep? Did he get a good meal? Is he what's his pulse ox? What's his blood sugar? All the stuff, the vitals and the stuff that you pay attention to all day, every single day to keep him going, right? And when you get to precious time, a lot of that goes away, right? We're not going to worry about pulse ox. We are going to be present as hard as it is. We are going to sometimes just sit and hold his hand and just be there and, tell him you love him and tell him you're grateful for all the wonderful memories and that sort of thing, so that when they do die, you did not spend those last days, weeks, even months in some cases, focused on silly stuff.
Right.
In hindsight, it's silly stuff. When I was a life-sustaining family caregiver, it's very important stuff. But when you become an end-of-life hospice caregiver, family caregiver, that stuff's not as important anymore. Physical comfort is important, but, what the blood sugar is and what the pulse ox is, those are not important. What's important is that we're just there and we're together. And it's hard. Precious time does not always feel precious, but it is. It is in that it's fleeting. It is in that you're not going to get a second chance to do it over. And it's actually the term precious time. It was in the first book. It's in Care Boss because it has kind of gotten larger than the books themselves. I have received lots of feedback from healthcare professionals who heard me talk about his term precious time. And they're like, oh my, this is great. This is a wonderful way to be able to tell a family this is really happening. And so some pretty important physicians and nurses have written about it. I have if you are in healthcare or in a field or situation where you feel like you need to be able to say to somebody, it's going to happen, it's happening soon, I have a free download on my website called the Precious Time Implementation Guide. It's written for healthcare professionals, but obviously anyone can read it and learn why it's so important to convey. I think Bob and I both felt the absolute worst thing, not the worst thing, but worse than your loved one dying at the end of an illness is when the caregiver turned griever said stuff like, I just thought we had more time.
Right. When it's unexpected, even though it's expected.
Right. But also because of those 4.5 years, right, that I've been focused on life-sustaining care. And then nobody really helped me see that we've turned a corner here. We're not sustaining anymore. We're headed toward realizing this vision.
I think that maybe physicians or nurses might think, well, surely the caregiver sees that we are at the end of life, but sometimes you really do need someone to point it out to you because you've been doing this every day for 4 years and you can't see it.
Absolutely. I think it's a big gap in hospice that the family caregiver is not getting a reorientation that says some of these things are important. And it doesn't always happen at hospice admission. Some people go ahead and say, you know what, I'm tired of these treatments that are making me feel worse than the disease itself. I just want to focus on being comfortable. I want to be admitted to hospice status. And we still are giving medications every day, and we're still paying attention to getting some food in them, that sort of thing. And maybe the transition to end of life family caregiver and precious time happens right later, not necessarily at admission to hospice. Not typically, because even though hospice is 6 months or less life expectancy, the average length of stay in hospice is only about 90 days.
Okay.
Right. So in general, we are not admitting our loved ones, our patients to hospice, soon enough. In cancer, it's 3 weeks, the average length of stay in hospice. So cancer, it's happening really late.
this download, can you tell me again what it is on your website?
Sure. Well, all the downloads are on the resources page of my website. My website is jenniferaobrien.com. And O'Brien is spelled with an E, Obrien, and there's no apostrophe.
Okay. And I'm going to include your website, your name, Jennifer O'Brien, the links to these downloads. And also, you mentioned your other book. Of course, we're talking about Care Boss today, but your other book is Hospice Doctor's Widow. I will include links to those two things as well. Thank you, Jennifer, for joining me today. This has been such a helpful conversation.
It's been my pleasure, Jill.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Death Readiness Podcast. If today's conversation with Jennifer O'Brien gave you a new perspective on caregiving or just made you feel seen, I'd love to hear from you. You can always reach me at Jill, Jill, at deathreadiness.com. And if we're not already connected, come find me on LinkedIn. I also have some exciting news. The Death Readiness email newsletter just launched. It's where I'll be sharing personal stories, practical tools, and insights I don't always get to cover on the podcast. I'll also be releasing bonus episodes exclusively for newsletter subscribers. If you're one of the next 10 people to subscribe, I'll send you a Death Readiness Podcast sticker, hot off the press. Just head to deathreadiness.com/subscribe or click the link in the show notes. If this episode made you think of someone in your life, a friend, a sibling, a colleague juggling caregiving behind the scenes, please share it with them. Because caregiving is leadership, but it doesn't have to be so lonely. In the next episode, I'm taking a look at something a little different. The movies we grew up on. Think Groundhog Day and 3 Men and a Baby. We'll explore how those films shaped the way we see ourselves, the roles we're expected to play, and even what we anticipate when we walk into a lawyer's office or a hospital room. You might be surprised by what still lingers. This is Death Readiness, real, messy, and yours to own. I'm Jill Mastriani, and I'm here to help you sort through it, especially when you don't know where to start.
Hi, I'm April, Jill's daughter. Thanks for listening to the Death Readiness Podcast. While my mom is an attorney, she's not your attorney. The Death Readiness Podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. It does not provide legal advice. For legal guidance tailored to your unique situation, consult with a licensed attorney in your state. To learn more about the services my mom offers, visit deathreadiness.com.